What if the sharpest mind in the room wasn't the one with all the answers, but the one with the questions no one dared to ask? That was the question echoing in the minds of the students at Westburg University as they filed into the philosophy lecture hall on the first day of the semester. The man standing at the front of the room wasn't just a teacher, he was a challenger of beliefs, a skeptic armed with logic sharper than a scalpel. His name was Professor Richard, a name spoken with admiration by colleagues and fear by freshmen. But that semester, something happened. Something different. A young man named Yusuf raised his hand and changed everything. Westburg University had long been regarded as more than just an institution of higher learning. It was an arena where intellect was both weapon and armor. The atmosphere on campus pulsed with intensity, fueled by students who prided themselves not just on grades, but on their ability to outthink, out-argue, and outlast one another in the relentless pursuit of truth. Professors there were less like traditional educators and more like philosophical gladiators, pushing their students beyond the boundaries of comfort and assumption. Ideas were not handed out like pamphlets. They were forged in the fires of dialectical scrutiny, stripped of pretense, and reconstructed through reason. Within this environment, claiming to know something was a bold act, one that required solid evidence and even stronger rationale. Among the intellectual titans that shaped the university's reputation, Professor Richard was a name spoken with both awe and apprehension. His classes were legendary, not for their popularity, but for their intensity. He was a man who could deconstruct centuries-old theological arguments in a single lecture, a thinker who viewed religious belief as the last bastion of human irrationality. For him, God was an outdated hypothesis, useful in the past to explain what science now illuminated. Faith, in his mind, was not a virtue, but a psychological defense mechanism, crafted to soften the harsh truths of an indifferent universe. If students walked into his classroom armed with belief, they had better come prepared to defend it like a thesis before a panel of skeptics. He didn't coddle, and he didn't tolerate flimsy thinking. His classroom was a battlefield, and only those who could match him in reason survived. On the first day of his full semester Philosophy 101 course, the room filled quickly. Students whispered excitedly, clutching laptops and notepads, knowing they were about to witness something electrifying. Professor Richard entered with his usual presence, grey suit pressed, glasses perched firmly, eyes alert and calculating. He walked to the front without acknowledging the murmurs or the energy that followed him. In his hand was a single sheet of paper, and as he placed it neatly on the table, the students could see a quote printed in bold, something by Bertrand Russell, his intellectual idol. Without any further preamble, he looked out at the sea of faces and declared with his signature firmness, "Let's begin." At the back of the room, a young man sat quietly, blending into the crowd, yet somehow emanating a quiet confidence. He wore a simple white shirt, his expression calm and unreadable. His name was Yusuf, and unlike most of the others in that room, he wasn't there to be impressed. He wasn't intimidated by the professor's reputation, nor was he eager to prove anything. But deep inside, he carried a truth he believed in, something not shaken by logic or bluster. He wasn't seeking confrontation, but he wasn't running from it either. The moment would come when he would speak, and when it did, the entire tone of the class, and perhaps the semester, would shift. Professor Richard stood before his Philosophy 101 class, his gaze sweeping over the room like a seasoned general surveying the battlefield. "Who among you believes in God?" he asked bluntly. A few hands rose hesitantly, others hovered in uncertainty, and many remained still, students reluctant to paint a target on themselves. Richard's smirk revealed his anticipation. "Interesting," he said. "Now, can you prove it?" Silence fell over the room like a thick fog. Then from the back row a single hand rose with quiet confidence. "My name is Yusuf, Professor. I'll try," the young man said calmly. A ripple ran through the classroom. A Muslim student challenging Richard the rationalist. Whispers erupted like sparks. But Yusuf remained composed, unmoved by the attention. "Very well," Richard replied, folding his arms. "Prove the existence of God." Yusuf paused before speaking. "Before I do, may I ask you something?" The professor raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Of course. Questions are welcome here." Yusuf nodded and asked, "Can you show me what reason looks like?" His voice was steady, measured. Richard responded, "It's not something you see. It's something you experience. Through logic, communication, decision-making. Yusuf leaned forward slightly. Exactly. We can't see reason directly, but we trust it, because we observe its effects. The same is true with God. The class grew still as Yusuf reached into his pocket and pulled out a pen. Holding it up, he posed a simple question. If I dropped this pen 100 times, would it ever spell out a meaningful sentence on its own? The professor scoffed. Of course not. Yusuf smiled gently. Then how can an entire universe, more complex than any sentence, come into being by chance? Richard frowned, his tone skeptical. You're using anthropocentric reasoning. Just because we find meaning in the universe doesn't mean it was designed. Yusuf remained unfazed. But doesn't the presence of order suggest intent? He asked. Richard countered. There's order in chaos too. That doesn't imply a designer. Yusuf nodded thoughtfully. True, but a chaotic order doesn't produce purpose. And yet here we are, discussing meaning, asking why instead of just how. The discussion deepened. Richard leaned against his desk, shifting the conversation. Let's say there is a God. Why allow suffering, disease, disasters, death? Yusuf responded with a question of his own. Have you ever seen a doctor give a child a painful injection? Richard nodded. Yes. Does the child understand it's for their own good? Yusuf continued. No, not fully. Yet the pain serves a purpose, healing. Could it be that life's trials, though painful, are part of something we don't fully grasp yet? The analogy landed with weight. The class stirred, visibly moved. Richard narrowed his eyes. So God is like a doctor inflicting pain for a greater purpose. Yusuf nodded again. Or a teacher assigning hard lessons. The struggle is part of the growth. What had started as a bold challenge turned into a daily ritual. Each class, Richard arrived with new questions, and each time Yusuf responded, not with aggression or arrogance, but with clarity, patience, and a quiet confidence that reshaped the energy in the room. Their debates were wide-ranging and profound. They explored morality without religion, the historical authenticity of scripture, the concept of eternity, and the mystery of human consciousness. They discussed near-death experiences, the paradox of time, and even the intersection of quantum mechanics and divine will. Other students began joining in. Some challenged Yusuf fiercely, while others stood by him. But no matter the pressure, Yusuf never ridiculed anyone. He never shouted, never belittled. He simply asked and answered, like someone who had already wrestled with doubt and emerged grounded. And over time, something subtle but powerful began to shift. The professor's trademark smirk faded. He wasn't losing the debates, but he was being moved by them. He no longer looked at Yusuf as the religious kid trying to swim in deep intellectual waters. He saw a peer, an equal, someone who didn't just believe, but understood why he believed. And that, more than anything, gave Richard pause. A crisis behind closed doors. Behind the confident posture and sharp wit that Professor Richard displayed in class, something had begun to unravel. At first, he dismissed his growing unease as academic curiosity, the kind that every philosopher experiences when faced with a compelling counterpoint. But as the days went by, he found Yusuf's words echoing in his mind long after the lectures ended. At night, as he sat in his study surrounded by shelves of Hume, Nietzsche, and Bertrand Russell, Richard found himself staring at the same books with a strange new discomfort. The questions he had mastered were no longer enough. What if I've been wrong? He thought. It wasn't just about losing a debate anymore. It was about confronting a worldview that was no longer unshakable. Away from the classroom and the watchful eyes of students, Richard began to read differently. He revisited theological works he once scoffed at, poring over classical arguments for God's existence with fresh eyes. But what surprised him most was when he picked up the Quran, not to refute it, but to understand what had so clearly shaped Yusuf's calm and clarity. He expected contradiction and confusion. Instead, he found rhythm, precision, and a sense of moral gravity that felt unsettlingly consistent. The Quran didn't just ask for belief, it challenged the reader to think, to reflect, to see. One night, he sat in silence after reading a passage about the heart not being blind, but the blindness lying in the heart itself. That line stuck with him. One afternoon, as students poured out after class, Richard found himself alone in the hallway with Yusuf. There was no audience, no debate, just two thinkers, man to man. Richard hesitated before speaking, his voice stripped of sarcasm. Yusuf, why do you never seem shaken, even when the questions get tough. Yusuf looked at him with quiet sincerity. Because I've already asked them myself, Professor, a long time ago, and when I searched with sincerity I found answers, or rather, the answers found me. Richard nodded slowly, unsure of what to say. He had spent years mastering arguments, but Yusuf had mastered conviction. In the weeks that followed, something changed in Richard's teaching. His tone softened. His approach became less combative and more curious. He started encouraging his students to question not just belief, but doubt as well. He admitted he was still on a journey, still wrestling with meaning. Don't just assume the absence of God is the intellectual high ground, he said one day. Sometimes, what we call reason is just a louder echo of our own assumptions. Students noticed the shift. And Yusuf, he simply listened, never triumphant, never boastful. He knew the journey wasn't about winning, it was about awakening. Whether Richard would one day believe in God or not, no one knew. But one thing was certain. Yusuf had planted a seed, not just in Richard, but in the classroom, in the hearts of students who now dared to think differently. The once dismissed religious kid had become a force of clarity in a room built for skepticism. And in a world that often confused faith with naivety, Yusuf had reminded them all that belief, when grounded in reason, reflection and sincerity, could be not only credible, but profoundly compelling. The verse that echoed reason. That verse stayed with him. It wasn't just poetic, it was precise, philosophical, reflective. It didn't demand blind faith, it invited contemplation. Richard found himself whispering the words out loud, tasting their cadence. Signs for those of understanding. He closed the Quran slowly, sat back in his chair, and stared out the window into the night sky. The stars seemed different, not because they had changed, but because he had. The universe, once a canvas of cold randomness, now felt like a message, subtle, vast, and patient. This wasn't conversion, not yet, but something had cracked. A wall in his mind, long built by intellectual pride and certainty, had begun to crumble. The questions turn inward. In the following days, Richard lectured less like a skeptic and more like a seeker. He stopped treating questions of God as intellectual chess matches and began engaging them as someone who needed to know. If the universe is a message, he posed to his class, then who's it from, and why us? Students noticed. His tone was no longer dismissive. It was vulnerable, raw. He started quoting not only Nietzsche and Sartre, but now Rumi, Al-Ghazali, and even the Prophet Muhammad, citing hadith not as dogma, but as philosophical insight. Some students were confused. Others were inspired. All of them were drawn in. This wasn't just education anymore. It was transformation. A hidden visit to the mosque. One evening, wrapped in a plain coat and anonymity, Richard visited a small mosque on the edge of town. He didn't tell anyone, not even Yusuf. He sat quietly in the back, watching, listening. The Quran was recited, and he felt the words more than he understood them. It wasn't spectacle or emotion that moved him. It was the stillness, the kind of stillness he hadn't known in years. A man sat beside him afterward and simply asked, "Are you searching?" Richard hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, I think I am." The death of certainty. Back on campus, Richard stood before his class one morning and paused for an unusually long time before beginning. "You all know me as someone who's always had answers," he said, "but lately, I'm realizing that maybe the most honest place to stand is in the middle of a question." He no longer feared not knowing. Doubt, he now realized, was not the enemy of belief, it was its beginning. What Yusuf had shown him was not proof, but permission, to doubt with sincerity, to question with humility, and to search without arrogance. From teaching to witnessing. And Yusuf, he watched it all unfold without claiming credit. He never pushed, never prodded. He simply remained present. A quiet witness to a man who had once challenged him to prove God's existence, now chasing the very traces he once dismissed. Because for Yusuf, Dawah wasn't about winning debates. It was about planting seeds. Some sprout immediately, others grow in secret, and some, like Richard, need time, tension, and a long walk through reason to find faith on the other side. So, what happens when the most logical mind meets the most sincere heart? Not a clash, but a transformation. a silent unfolding where ego steps aside and truth is given space to speak. This story isn't about winning an argument. It's about what happens when a soul begins to listen, not just with the ears but with the heart. It's about a professor who prided himself on reason, discovering that faith isn't the opposite of logic, but perhaps its highest form, because sometimes the sharpest arguments are quiet, and the most powerful answers come from the questions we're too afraid to ask. So wherever you are in your journey, skeptic, seeker, or believer, may you never stop asking, because the search itself is sacred. Thanks for watching.